homes that we live in. And for a lot of people, that might not necessarily seem like a subject that is very tightly connected to development. Obviously, shelter is one of the basic human needs. And there is an enormous deficit around the world in people who do not have access to safe, healthy, dignified housing of their own. So I think we can look at it from that perspective, that from the wider development idea, providing, making sure that people have access to safe, affordable, healthy structures, houses, homes, is one of the primary human needs, right? And so lots of development projects talk about how to do that. But I'm going to argue in class today that the way that we do that, the way that this need is met, is a fundamental consideration that often isn't discussed. And so we're gonna try and talk a little bit about that. As the class outline, I want to try and make a clear connection to the idea of housing as a development need, and not only as a development need, but how the homes that we live in, uh, how the process of providing those homes, of creating those homes, of bringing them into existence, either helps or hurts a process of true endogenous community development. We're going to talk about, many NGOs will see that there's a rural community, that people live in substandard housing, and the development model will be to bring in a professional builder, build 50 to 100 concrete block homes, hand over the keys to the homes, and then leave. That's certainly one way to try and respond to this need. Another way would be working with local builders, empowering young people to learn how to build vernacular structures using earthen materials, empowering the community to provide a need for themselves. Those are two different strategies to respond to the same need. And I want to talk about how, unfortunately, the vast majority of development projects that seek to respond to the need of housing uh, kind of create this idea of housing is westernization. I mentioned in past classes that one of the driving reasons that led me to step away from kind of a full-time career in community development was because I see that so many projects are focused on development as westernization, as forcefully imposing a worldview, a way of understanding the world, a way of relating to the world. And that generally happens in detriment to traditional ways of responding, traditional ways of fulfilling, the basic human needs. So we're going to talk a little bit about housing as westernization and what are the effects of that. And I want to talk about the ecological and environmental consequences of this widespread adoption of one way of housing, right? I live in this tiny little mountain village in El Salvador, and I look out my window right now, and there are dozens of homes kind of scattered across the landscape, and the vast majority of those have been built in the last 10 or 15 years. And they're concrete cinder block houses, which I don't know. I know that most of our students here are from Africa. But if we went back just 20 years ago, every one of those houses would have been built from adobe blocks. Adobe is earthen, from clay, from soil beneath our feet. They were usually built by the people themselves, the people who lived in the homes. They were generally very affordable. And today, to build these houses that I see around my landscape, there's this enormous expense associated with it. You have to hire a professional builder or someone who works as specifically as a house builder. There's an enormous carbon and environmental footprint associated with that. So it's kind of something has happened in the world of housing over the last couple of decades here in Central America, where I live, and I think around the world. And it's essentially this westernization of this idea that there is only one type of home that is valuable, that is useful, that is dignified, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about, what are the effects of this? What are the effects of when people lose the autonomy to build their own homes and they lose the vernacular traditions? And then finally, I want to talk a little about natural building as empowerment. We were fortunate enough to get funding during the last couple of years that I was working with a development organization in Guatemala. We received funding to teach natural building, essentially to try and rescue these vernacular traditional building techniques as a way of helping communities provide a need for themselves. So I want to talk a little bit about that and then share a few case studies of different communities around the world who have found a sense of autonomy, a sense of empowerment about rejecting this idea that the only possible pathway to a dignified house is through these Western concepts of what housing is supposed to be like. Okay, so let's talk about housing as Westernization. You see here, these are two pictures from kind of that represent housing alternatives here in Central America, probably housing alternatives around the world. The house on the top, as you can see, is made from adobe, made from mud, made from a traditional building material. Mud is available in pretty much every building site around the world, unless you live maybe on a sandy island somewhere. But in the vast majority of places, people can make their own homes with the substance that is underneath their feet. Around the world, vernacular building traditions have always responded about how to build homes with locally available materials. There were people who learned how to do that. These were homes that, when built correctly, lasted hundreds of years, that were extremely durable. They responded to the needs of the people who inhabited these homes. And in the last, here in El Salvador, where I live, over the last 20 years, probably millions of these homes, especially in rural areas, in the semi-urban areas around the big city, began to be demolished. And people, instead of building this, they wanted this, right? These concrete cinder block box homes that are all similar, that are built by a kind of a building professional elite, that are expensive, that come with an enormous ecological footprint. So I want to start with this quote. I shared this in a past class. Gustavo Esteva is a post-development thinker, and he says, for 2/3 of the people on Earth, to think of development, any kind of development, requires first the perception of themselves as underdeveloped in a subordinate position after comparing their own situation with an established standard. And so when I look at these two homes right here, it becomes very obvious to me that in terms of actual, let's say, performance, in terms of actual usefulness, this adobe home is not any different than this house in terms of providing shelter, protecting from the elements, giving people a dignified, safe space to live. All of the, what shelter is supposed to provide as a human need. But why are millions of people around the world opting for this type of home instead of this type of home? And I think it stems from this kind of epistemological framework, this idea that has infiltrated the minds that this home is a developed house, and this house is an example of underdevelopment, of poverty, of scarcity, of everything that of backwardness, of old traditions that need to be left behind. And so I think one of the stimuli that is pushing people to lose traditional vernacular building traditions is this idea that Western forms of development are inherently better, right? Without even looking at the data, without looking at the reality of the situation. If it comes from the outside, it must be better, right? Coca-Cola is going to be better than the local fruit juice just because it comes from the outside. And that's what that form of the mindset is something that that I think causes an enormous amount of problems for rural communities and for people who are working in the development industry. Throughout most of the developing world, the past decades have seen a massive movement away from vernacular housing alternatives, mostly earth and building techniques, as people have become convinced that market-driven, westernized, modern building techniques are superior to the vernacular traditions. And again, I think it's very important to say and understand that that is not necessarily not necessarily true. There are some instances, let's to be honest, about certain vernacular traditions where building with adobe in areas where there's lots of earthquakes could be considered a certain vulnerability. But that doesn't mean necessarily that transitioning to these homes is the best way. There are ways to strengthen, to complement traditional building techniques. But what has happened is this type of home has become abandoned, and this type of home, this Western model of what it supposedly means to live in a developed modern house, has taken over. Um, Here in Central America, where I live, there's an enormous amount of migration. There has been for the past probably 30, 40 years. El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, the kind of the four countries that make up the main bulk of Central America, receive almost $42 billion in remittance money. Money that migrants who go mostly to the United States and Canada send back. So every, a Salvadoran father or mother or son or daughter will go to the United States, find a job. This is undocumented migration, of course, and they usually send back between 20, 30, 40% of their weekly paycheck. A recent study here in El Salvador found out that almost more than a third, 35% of that money, of those billions of dollars that were being sent back every month, were being invested in some sort of housing or construction, right? And when I was in Guatemala in 2014, we did a poll amongst young people in the villages where we worked, and over 70% of the young men who were thinking about wanting to migrate to the United States, they stated that their primary reason for wanting to migrate to the United States was to save money in order to build a modern house. That's why people generally want to migrate these days. Migration is a pathway to show that you are developed. In this picture here, I don't know if you can see it. This is kind of funny. A lot of these people go to the United States and they want to build this great house. And they don't have any land because land is super expensive. So they go back and they build these incredible structures that, as soon as the earth begins to move, it's going to fall over. But the idea is that this is progress. It's made out of cement. It has steel in it. It's a way to show to your neighbors and to other people in your community that you are developed now, because now you have built a house, even though the thing's about to fall over as soon as it, in the first windy day or whatever. So yeah, housing is Westernization. In the past couple courses, I've shared lots of discussion from Ivan Illich, who is an Austrian philosopher and thinker, someone who's been very, very impactful on my own thought. And Illich actually talked a lot about the idea of housing. He had this idea of really trying to rescue and revalue what he called the vernacular. And the idea of the vernacular is things that are traditional, things that respond to place. This type of house right here, never responds to a place. It's a foreign idea imported from the outside. Whereas, this type of home here, this is a home in a building style that responds to tradition, that responds to the traditions, the possibilities, the ecological realities of the place. And Illich always said that, what we should do, those of us who work in development, is to try and find all of the goodness, all of the common sense that came from these vernacular traditions, and try to rescue those, try to revalue those. So Illich spoke about how the values and ethics of the vernacular are applied to the world of homes in which we live. He obviously talked a lot about education. We had a class about education a couple of weeks ago, but he also talked about architecture, about homes, right? For him, vernacular architecture was not simply a type of local or regional construction using traditional materials and resources from the area. It was that, but beyond that, vernacular ways of building, of inhabiting a place, were fundamentally opposed to the housing market, right, of modernity. He said this idea of a house as a commodity, house as something to speculate with, as an investment, that idea did not exist in traditional ways of living. It was more practical. It was more tangible, right? The house was a place to dwell. It was a shelter. It was a way to respond to one of the most basic human needs, right? And Illich, he spent a lot of time here in Latin America, and he saw how government programs, along with big NGOs, along with private finance, came into these small rural communities in Puerto Rico and Mexico, and I'm sure it's happened all over the world, where they essentially attempt to extinguish traditional forms of vernacular home construction in the pursuit of modernizing the housing stock and providing people with the right to dignified housing. And so it was almost from this kind of I guess you could say kind of progressive standpoint, this idea that big NGOs together with government workers and others said, oh, look at these poor people, they're living in homes that are made of mud, right? And they never took the opportunity to actually go inside and look how nice those homes were, how beautiful they could be, how affordable they were. But no, it's this idea, they're made from mud, it's a symbol of poverty, we're going to give people the right to live in a modern house, right? And so what happened was people were generally acceptance of that. There was an enormous, especially amongst NGOs around the world, building programs, which essentially said, here, we'll give you a free house. And most people said, sure, why not? And what happened over time was that this led to the extinction, the loss of traditional vernacular building techniques. Another kind of response or another effect of this was that this took the autonomy out of the hands of individuals, families, and communities and turned housing into a market-driven commodity. Once the free houses were over, right? Once all of these these programs kind of ended and funding ended, then these communities had lost the ability to build their own homes. And now the only pathway to home ownership, which is one of the most important, indicators of wealth and economic well-being, the only way you could have a home is if you had an enormous amount of money. And then the mortgages came in and people started financing their futures. This idea of well, if I want a home, I'm going to have to go to the bank and get $100,000 loan and spend the next 30 years of my life paying it off. It all kind of the disruption of this vernacular way of providing for a human need led to this commodity-driven market, which essentially took housing as a right out of the hands of people. People used to, if they wanted a home, they built it themselves, right? There were obviously, better homes and more structurally sound and things like that, but it was something that people could provide for themselves. Illich also talked very interesting about kind of the aesthetic underpinning of the homes we live in. And he used the word dwell a lot. He said, vernacular communities didn't have a home as an investment. It wasn't a space where they, where they were trying to create a commodity that they could then sell in the future. A home was a place to dwell. It was a place where they could inhabit, where they could live, where they could provide for their needs, right? By their own effort, by their own work, with their own skills, with their own intelligence. And he talked a lot about how vernacular architecture was a pathway towards dwelling in place versus this idea of home is garage. This is a picture here, maybe about half an hour from where I live. A lot of people have decided that the best, the modern way to live is in these blocks of row houses. So all of these people who used to live in these types of homes here used to live in wattle and daub and adobe homes that they built themselves, things that were unique and beautiful. And now they're living in these mass-produced homes that are essentially little blocks, repeated blocks, one after another. And this is what Illich referred to as garages. He said, this isn't a home. This isn't a dwelling place. This is a garage. And he said, here's a quote from one of his books. He says, the environment has been redefined as a resource for the production of garages for people, commodities, and cars. Housing provides cubicles in which residents are housed, he criticized. The vernacular space of dwelling is replaced by the homogeneous space of the garage. And obviously, when you see these mass housing projects, homogeneous is a great adjective, a great way to describe it, because it's the same. He says housing settlements today look the same from Taiwan to Ohio, from Lima to Beijing, from Africa to Central America. These types of homes that are mass produced, there's really nothing local about them, nothing distinctive, nothing that I can look at it and say, oh, this is a beautiful example of African architecture, but this is a beautiful example of Mayan architecture. No, it's all the same. It's this homogeneous thing. He says everywhere you find the same garage for the human, shelves. And he said, today these type of homes are shelves to store the workforce overnight, handy for the means of its transportation. And in difference to that, vernacular architectural traditions allowed people to dwell. And he said, only humans can dwell, Illich says. To dwell is an art, and the art of dwelling is part of the art of living. Dwelling is an activity that lies beyond the reach of the architect because, above all, because no two communities dwell alike, right? And one of the things that's really I think sad about our modern world is the loss of diverse expressions of life, right? It's really unfortunate when I can go to Africa and Asia, North America, South America, and see this same model of home reproduced millions of times. We lose the art of dwelling, the art of creating something special, something unique, something that speaks about our culture, our abilities, the local environment where we live. So what are some of the effects of this homogenization of housing is westernization, right? The idea that there's only one type of house, one model of house, one aesthetic of house that needs to be reproduced around the world. What are some of the effects of that, right? So obviously, like I said at the beginning, shelter is one of the basic primary human needs. And the question that I want us to think about today is what is lost when individuals and communities lose the skills, the abilities, and even the right to provide this need for themselves. Here's again two pictures. This is a major housing project outside of San Salvador, the main city of the country where I live, or the main city of the country where I live. And as you can tell, it's one model of house reproduced. The only difference is that they alternate colors. Some are yellow, some are red, some are green. But it's this model of mass production, right? And this is a village just outside of about an hour and a half outside of San Salvador, a place that's kind of touristy, that's well known. And you walk through these streets, and it's completely different. There's a similar model. Most homes are made from adobe. They use the clay tile roofing, but there's a difference in aesthetic pleasantfulness, I would say, about usefulness. These types of homes here, I think I recently saw the going price is around 150,000 US dollars, right? The vast majority of people in San Salvador don't have that amount of money. In order to achieve this status of this type of home, people mortgage away their entire futures. This type of house here can probably be built for a couple $1,000s, maybe 1,000, maybe less, by people's own hands, with their own work, with a little of knowledge, with the help of a community, with the help of friends. There's a fundamental difference there in terms of the loss of autonomy, right? And one of the things I think that's important to understand is that this one of the themes of modernity, I think, is replacing the ability of people and communities and cultures to produce something for themselves with this kind of commodity mindset, right? So a lot of development organizations come into small communities and say that what you need is to replicate this model, right? And you can't do that yourselves. So we're going to provide you with the means, usually by inserting communities into the monetary economy, so that you can purchase this, right? So you lose the ability, the skills, the knowledge, the tradition of providing something for yourselves, and in replace, you find you supposedly enter into the market economy so you can have a certain amount of money so that you can trade your labor so that you can purchase something outside of yourself. It's kind of like that. I'm sure a lot of people have heard the story of a fisherman who is sitting on the banks or sitting on the shore, and he's mending his nets, and a development official comes along, or a development worker, and he says, "Oh, what you doing?" "Oh, I'm mending my nets because I'm going to go out fishing tomorrow morning, see if I can catch some fish and feed my family." And he said, "Here, I can give you this loan, right? And with this loan, instead of having one boat, you can buy two. And once you have two boats, you can hire someone who can go out fishing with you, and you can feed just as much, and you can have double the amount of production, and then you can reinvest that money and have three boats." And then you'll grow, you'll have more money, and then eventually you can stop fishing altogether and just pay your workers. And the fisherman looks at him, he's like, and so you're saying that if I do this, if I follow this model that you're putting forth, the goal will be eventually I can sit here on this beach and relax and watch the waves. And they're like, "Yeah, that's exactly what you can do." And he's like, "Well, I'm kind of enjoying that right now. That's exactly what I'm doing. I'm sitting here mending my nets, watching the sunset. So why do I want to go through all of this effort to do something, right?" And so this idea of development, I would say this false or this faulty idea of development is tricking people or telling people that they need to lose the skills or forget the traditions that allowed them to provide for themselves. And this is something that, for example, in the world of food production, has happened on a massive scale around the world, right? If you go back just a couple decades, the vast majority of people in rural areas produced an enormous amount of food for themselves. This subsistence idea of agriculture. And not necessarily each individual family, but a community itself would provide for itself with with what could be grown locally. Over the last 3, 4, 5 decades, those traditions of subsistence have been lost out. Small farmers were pushed off the land; they were moved into the cities. The people who remained on the land, instead of growing subsistence crops that they could consume or sell to their neighbors, they were pushed into these export-oriented crops, such as growing coffee for the export market. And so what we have today is this centralization of the production of food. Food is now being produced by an expert, by large farmers, by farming corporations. And what we have is people are eating less nutritious food. There's an enormous obesity crisis around the world, one of the primary public health crisis. There's an enormous amount of environmental damage caused by industrial food production. And that same model, right, of centralizing the production for human needs into smaller amounts of professional hands is the same thing we see in housing, for example. Another effect, I guess you could say, of this professionalization of housing, of the loss of vernacular traditions, is that there's an enormous environmental problematic with that. For example, a traditional 2,500 square foot home that's kind of tradition in the United States and Europe likely uses lumber that was sourced from up to 130 different trees that were cut down, mostly from intensive monoculture forestry plantations. A single story, 1,500 square foot house will require over 400 bags of 100-pound bags of cement. And that's just for the foundation, essentially. An additional 87 bags of cement are needed to complete the brickwork, the cement, for a 1,500 square foot house. Approximately between 3 and 4,000 kilos of steel is required to build a 1,000 square foot structure. As a whole, the worldwide construction industry uses 32% of the world's natural resources. So there's this enormous demand for resources. When you want to build these massive, mass-produced, huge houses, this obviously creates an enormous demand for resources, more mining, more extraction, and all of the biodiversity loss, the loss of traditional forests, all of that comes with that, right? And beyond that, there's also an enormous amount of energy that's needed for these types of homes. According to the Energy Information Administration, a third of the total carbon dioxide CO2 emissions in the United States were associated with electricity generation. Real estate, so the homes, the businesses, the schools, the construction industry, has one of the highest carbon footprints, producing around 30% of global annual emissions and consuming 40% of the world's energy. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency estimates that the levels of indoor air pollutants are sometimes 2 to 5 times higher than outdoor levels. And in some cases, these levels can exceed 100 times that of outdoor levels of the same pollutants. So what happens, again, when we move from this type of house here to this type of house here? Well, besides the loss of autonomy that we've talked about, there's also this enormous effect on the natural world, right? This home right here was built mainly from clay soil that was dug out of the ground right near. In fact, when most people, when you're making your home foundation, you excavate a little bit of soil. That same soil that you excavate can be used in building the walls and building the roof of your home. All of a sudden, when you opt for this model, you need an enormous amount of concrete, of steel, of wood, and many of these are sourced from enormous distances at an enormous environmental cost. In terms of embodied energy footprint, what is that? A lot of times we talk about all of the carbon emissions associated with heating and cooling and lighting and powering our homes. But beyond that, there's what's called the embodied energy footprint, and that is calculated by considering the total amount of energy used during the mining and acquisition of natural resources, the manufacturing and industrial process of transforming those raw resources into usable building components, the transportation of those building materials from the source to the origin of your home, the energy process used during the building process itself, and the energy used to operate the home throughout its lifetime. And this is where the footprint, the real environmental footprint of the building industry, becomes clear, becomes evident, right? Before, the embodied energy footprint of a vernacular, naturally built house was how much energy your body used to dig up some dirt, to squish it into blocks and to put it up onto the wall. Now you have to think about how much energy does a cement mine use? How much energy does it take to extract steel from the ground and manufacture it into rebar or into posts or whatever? How much energy does it take for these massive monoculture forestry plantations where trees are cut down, milled into lumber, and then shipped from one part of the world to the other part of the world? All of this needs to be taken into consideration. And what we see is this model of westernized housing comes with an enormous environmental footprint. And obviously, with all of the ecological crises we're facing, whether it be global climate change, biodiversity loss, demanding more materials and demanding more energy is a very, very serious problem, right? And this idea of housing is westernization. If we try to convince the 8 billion people in the world today that the only way they can have dignified housing is by replicating or mimicking this westernized model that is extremely environmental damaging, well, we're going to push ourselves even further into climate change, further into biodiversity loss, et cetera, et cetera. And again, for me, one of the most dangerous aspects of this idea of convincing people around the world that westernized housing is the only dignified way to live is this loss of tradition, this loss of the vernacular, the loss of autonomy that comes with knowing how to provide for your own basic needs, both as an individual and as a community. So the movement towards mass-produced, professionally built, environmentally damaging homes around the world has led to, one, a massive housing deficit that previously didn't exist, right? So think about that. When people had the ability and the knowledge and the skills to build their own homes, even if they were simple, even if they could have been improved upon, but people knew how to do that, right? So there wasn't a housing deficit. If you needed to build a home, you took some mud from where you were, you took some wood from where you were, and you built a home. Now people have lost that ability. A lot of times it's illegal in urban areas to try and build something out of earthen building techniques. So now you have this issue of deficit, of homelessness, of people who have to spend an enormous amount of their money on rent in urban areas, for example. Another effect is that there's this increasing demand for raw materials. If we want to provide everybody with a 1,500 square foot home made from concrete and steel and mass-produced wood, well, we're going to have to mine all of these materials. We're going to have to extract more and more from the Earth's biosphere. To power these homes and to build these homes, we're going to need an enormous amount of energy, and that leads to even more carbon emissions, pushing us even further into the vulnerabilities that come with climate change. And beyond that, people lose the skills, abilities, and rights to build a home for oneself. And this, I think, is the definition, the essence of what's often called a progress trap, right? A progress trap is a condition human society experience when, in pursuing so-called progress through supposed human ingenuity, we inadvertently introduce problems that we don't have the resources or the political will to solve for fear of short-term losses in status, stability, or quality of life, right? So we adopted almost universally this idea that there's only one form of housing that is correct, that is dignified, and by doing that, we've put ourselves in this trap. If we continue to try and provide 8 billion homes following this model, we're going to fall into all sorts of environmental problems. At the same time, we've lost a lot of communities, and individuals have lost the ability to try and create these homes in a more environmentally safe, responsible manner, right? And lastly, again, following from Illich, Illich says that one of the things that comes with turning housing, the right to housing, into a commodity, into something that people have to purchase, is it creates a false sense of scarcity, right? So when individuals, families, and communities are no longer able to provide for themselves one of the basic needs of human life, shelter in this case, then that need is taken over or monopolized by the market, professionals, or the state. And here's a quote from Millich. He says, "Essential human goods once belonged to the commons," right? The commons, something that was available, that should be available to everybody, but had been subordinated to economic imperatives to the extent that the mundane activities of daily life were no longer that. They had come to entail incessant production and consumption, Health, for example, once something individuals and communities could cultivate, had become a commodity dispensed by hospitals and medical providers, just as knowledge had been replaced with credentialist pursuit of institutionally sanctioned prestige in school, right? So knowledge and health used to be things that people sought to provide for themselves. Obviously, there were times when they needed to seek out knowledge from people in the community or seek out curing from people in the community, but in general, it was something that people provided for themselves as much as possible. The same could be said of housing. And now that we don't have that, there's a shortage, a supposed shortage in housing, in education, and in health, for example. So how can natural building act as an empowerment, a tool of empowerment? Today, and this is a definition that I've kind of come up with when I think about how we can rescue or save this idea of development from its kind of its corruption as westernization. Obviously, I think you've probably gained from this class and past that I'm very skeptical of this idea that the pathway towards development is through modernization or westernization or whatever we want to call it. So for me, true development hinges on returning a sense of autonomy and sovereignty to individuals and communities in the sense of being able to provide for themselves as locally as possible the basic needs for human survival and well-being. Development projects and development initiatives that seek to do that, I think, offer a lot of hope, right? So in a world where the vast majority of people have forgotten the skills and the aptitudes and the abilities, these vernacular building techniques, natural building, teaching, reteaching, relearning how to build homes with local materials, with local knowledge, offers a pathway forward. And around the world, like I said, in most parts of the world, earthen construction, building with soil, with clay, with mud, is one of kind of this universal. There's different forms. For example, here in Central America, we do adobe bricks. In other parts of the world, there's more. There's different ways to build with mud, to build with clay. But in general, these techniques are easy to learn. They're user-friendly, non-professional in nature. You don't have to have a doctorate in architecture to build a home, using natural materials. They're locally available, of course, right? You don't have to depend on wood that's mined or steel that's mined in one part of the world and shipped across the world. They're things that you can find in your own backyard, in your community, in the local forest. They're environmentally friendly, carbon neutral. Generally, they're more aesthetically pleasing than these mass-produced kind of box houses. They lead to healthy home environments, right? You're not another problem with this massification of housing is that a lot of the building materials are extremely unhealthy. People are inhaling toxic chemicals all day long, whereas homemade from mud is generally going to be healthier, and potentially create a sense of community and belonging. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about this today is because my family and I, when we first moved to our farm, we built our own house out of mud, out of clay. It was something that I always wanted to do. It was something that made sense to me. I didn't want to inherit a lot of debt. I didn't want to put myself in a situation of debt by financing a house. And I wanted to learn. So together with my wife, and we had our 6-month-old daughter at that time, we learned little by little. We put together our own home. And as we were doing that, some of our neighbors would come over and they're like, "What are you guys doing? We've never seen people build houses. People have adobe homes, but we used a technique known as cob, which is kind of a different way of building with mud. And people came and looked, and one of our neighbors said, "I'd like to help you out a few days to try and learn." So he came and helped us out, and then another neighbor came. And over the ensuing years, after we moved into our home, 4 of our neighbors built their own homes following the same techniques because they realized that, look, building a house is expensive, right? And if we can do this ourselves, we can save an enormous amount of money. Each house is different. It reflects kind of the likes, the creativity, the uniqueness of each family around here. And it was extremely environmentally friendly. People used mud that they found on their own pieces of land, using their own labor, etc. Right. So I want to end real quick with maybe 2 or 3. I don't know if I'll go through all of these case studies about different projects that I've worked on over the past couple of years related to natural construction. So in Guatemala, there's a small indigenous university called the Shield University. And yeah, like I said, the desire to save money in order to build a cement and cinder block home is one of the main drivers of migration in Central America. Like I said, young people want to build this modernist house, and to do that, to save money, they have to go to the United States or Canada. This Issue University started about 15 years ago now as a educational institute aimed at rescuing traditional knowledge pathways and helping Ishil young people to find ways to remain in their communities, right? And the Yeshua University, when they're thinking about, how to respond to this need that people wanted for wanting to build these mass produced, mostly concrete homes, they said, well, we're going to build our own campus. We're going to build, our own the schools that we're going to use to teach out of traditional vernacular building materials, right? And we're going to teach our students how to do that. And so this process of building the campus, wasn't they didn't hire a professional company to come in and build these massive classrooms, but they involved the students in the process of designing their own homes, their own campuses, their own schoolhouses. People came together and built it. The community came together and taught traditional ways of building. And so what happened was you had this kind of rescuing of vernacular building traditions while also showing young people the possibility of autonomously constructing a house of one's own in order to avoid migration, right? And so this simple task of, instead, it would have been a lot easier to have applied for grant money and hired a professional company to build these really nice modernist schools, university campus. But instead of doing that, the Yeshua University said, we're going to invest a little bit more time, we're going to invest more money, more effort, and we're going to build something that responds to our values, that is going to be of value to our students, right? It was a really interesting project. In Barichara is a small town in the mountains of Colombia. It's a beautiful town. You can tell by these pictures here. They still have this kind of colonial aesthetic of cobblestone streets, and all of the houses are made out of mud with these kind of traditional clay roofing tiles. And one of the things that's interesting is when you walk through this town, you will see absolutely zero homes made out of concrete. No concrete blocks, no steel structures. All of the homes are built out of this traditional building material. And that happened because about 30 years ago, when a lot of money started pouring into the community, most because young people had migrated to Bogota, which is the big city, and people started sending money back, and there was this desire to tear down these old homes that were, a relic of the past, and build these new big homes. And the community said, no, stop. We have a beautiful community. This way of building traditional homes is unique. And eventually there was a mayor, a local government, that trained young people. They said, look, let's maintain our traditions. And so they opened this natural building school, where older builders who knew how to build these traditional homes shared that knowledge, transmitted that knowledge to the younger generations. The local mayor's office created an ordinance or local law that prohibited building with cement, with concrete, with steel. The results are today is that Barichara has turned into this tourist kind of mecca. It's this place where lots and lots of people go because it's beautiful. It's like a step back in time. It's unique. It's obviously beautiful, and it created a pathway towards affordable housing. Young people, there's now this cooperative of young natural builders. So if somebody wants to build a natural home, but they don't have the time or the ability to do so themselves, they can hire a locally trained group of young builders. They can build these natural homes for people at a much more affordable cost. And then lastly, kind of near where I live, there's a small town of La Palma. There's a group of women who had been renting homes in the small town, and who were kind of getting frustrated that rental prices continued to go up and up and up. And there's this dream of, how can we own a home of ourselves? And eventually they came together. They formed a cooperative called Acoviamet, which means it's a cooperative for affordable housing. And what they did is that they were able to secure this piece of land through a grant money. And then they're thinking, well, one way we could do is we could divide up this piece of land, and everybody can, hire a local builder and build their own homes. But what they decided was that, no, we're gonna change this model. We're gonna do something different, right? And so what they did is they created these kind of bylaws of this cooperative, that anybody who wanted to join the cooperative would be given a small plot of land for free, right? So if you want to join this building cooperative, here's a piece of land. But in order to receive this piece of land, you were obliged to dedicate, I think it was, yeah, 5 full days of labor, of your own work each month, to help build the homes of the entire group of the community, right? Through this kind of agreement of mutual and reciprocal support. Another part of the agreement was that you weren't able to build a home out of cement or concrete or steel or whatever. The homes were to be built exclusively from the vernacular earthen building techniques. So here's a picture of them building, a traditional adobe home, reinforced with bamboo. So using traditional building techniques, and the order of the construction of the homes was determined by seniority. So if you know, one of the first people who entered the cooperative, your home was going to be built first, but you had to continue to offer your 5 days of labor so that, over the last 3 or 4 years, if you go to this community now, there's about 15 homes that are being built. And 5 days a month, the community comes together and they work together to build other people's homes using these traditional vernacular building techniques that they do themselves for extremely affordable, right? And so these are 3 kind of case studies, I think, of how natural building offers a pathway towards autonomy, towards empowerment, and kind of questioning this idea that development has to replicate westernized norms of what it means